James writes his letter to a group of Christians who are suffering. And we know that because he opens his letter telling them to count all their various trials as joy. They're going through these trials, times of testing, persecution, and James wants them to endure and stand firm in the midst of these trials, these tests, and he wants them to stand firm with joy. You come down to verse 12, and this is what you find. Blessed is the man who endures temptation or testing or trial. For when he has been approved, he will receive the crown of life, which the Lord has promised to those who love him. James is going to go on from here and talk about temptation and how we deal with temptation. He's going to show that temptation doesn't come from God. It arises from our own evil desires. We make ourselves susceptible to temptation. And so he's moved from trials that come to us in God's providence, trials that are times of testing or persecution, to temptation, and especially temptations that come with those times of trial. And this verse 12, is something of a bridge between those two sections. But I think we can get a deeper sense of what James is doing here, and what he was calling them to, his original audience, what he's calling us to today as well, if we consider the broader context of this letter. I think we can actually place the letter of James, the writing of this letter, within a pretty narrow window of time in terms of that apostolic era. James tells us at the very beginning of the letter that he is writing to the Diaspora, to the 12 tribes which are scattered abroad. So these are Jewish Christians predominantly, who had been in Jerusalem, who have now scattered. Well, when did this take place? Well, the book of Acts tells us. In Acts chapter 6 and 7, we have the story of Stephen. And Stephen is one of the first deacons. He becomes a prominent spokesman for the church, preaching the gospel. Jewish opposition arises, and they end up putting Stephen on trial. So he undergoes something of a trial in a more literal sense, and he's joyful in the midst of this trial. He endures and stands firm in the midst of this trial. And at the end of it, they stone him. So they have condemned him, but God vindicates him, God justifies him, and heaven is open, and he is received into heavenly glory. Jesus rises up from his throne to welcome Stephen into heavenly habitations, heavenly glory. Just after that, then, in Acts chapter 8, is when the diaspora takes place. Because of Stephen's martyrdom and because of this Jewish opposition to the church, this Jewish persecution, these Jewish Christians scatter. They fan out from Jerusalem into other parts of the Roman Empire. And Luke uses that same language that James does, that diaspora language, to describe what's happening. So James is writing to those Christians who have fanned out from Jerusalem after Stephen's martyrdom. That's the context. Now, I think that James, who wrote this letter, is the brother of John. He himself is martyred by Herod in Acts chapter 12. So this letter is written sometime between Acts 8 and Acts 12, sometime between Stephen's martyrdom and James' own martyrdom. Now, this is what's interesting. Obviously, Stephen is a great hero of the faith. He's the first martyr, and he endures this trial. Just as Jesus had his trial, Stephen has his trial. And just as Jesus is faithful and speaks truth in his trial, so does Stephen. And just as Jesus seeks to forgive those who are wrongly persecuting him, wrongly accusing him, so Stephen does the same with his false accusers. And then, of course, Stephen enters into heavenly glory when he is stoned. But this is what's interesting. The way James describes this in verse 12, I think he's recalling the martyrdom of Stephen, and he's calling on those he writes to imitate Stephen, to imitate the way Stephen endured trial and testing. Blessed is the man who endures temptation, for when he has been approved. So James views any crisis they're going through, any persecution or trial, as a kind of legal trial. And there's going to be a verdict at the end. And if you want to be approved, this is what you must do. You must endure. You must stand firm. And then you will receive the crown of life. Well, we miss this in English, but the Greek word for crown is Stephanon. It is Stephen's name, basically. So you'll receive the Stephen of life if you endure this trial, if you stand firm. And I think he's recalling Stephen's martyrdom here. He's saying, be like Stephen. Stephen was faithful. Remember Stephen. He was crowned with life. you can be crowned with life as well. It's kind of like the cry of Texans in their battle for independence. They would cry out, "Remember the Alamo." They had many men who were lost at the Alamo. They wanted to remember their bravery, their sacrifice, their courage, all of that, and that would spur them on. They could imitate that in later battles. Remember the Alamo. James here is saying, remember Stephen. Remember Stephen's martyrdom. Remember how he endured trial and testing and temptation. Now you go do the same. And just as Stephen was welcomed into heavenly glory, so you will be welcomed into heavenly glory as well. You'll be crowned. Like Stephen, you'll be crowned. Stephen lived up to his name and was crowned with this crown of life. You'll be crowned if you imitate his faith, if you endure and stand firm in the same way.